Hello guys, welcome back to another one. Today I want to be talking about the Aorus FO27Q3. It's an OLED monitor that's 1440p and 360Hz. Now I'll also be comparing it to 360Hz IPS in this video, and also telling you a little bit about some of the flaws that are not talked as much about that OLED has, that are just inherent to OLED displays. That way you can spend your money wisely because yeah, I spent 929 euros on this monitor. That's a lot of money. Okay, so let's get right into it. The first issue that I want to talk about, and I just want to get into the cons first that are OLED specific, then QD-OLED specific, then monitor specific. Alright, let's really get into it now. So, variable refresh rate flicker. This is something I don't even want to show footage of. That's how bad it is, alright? Somebody is gonna have a seizure. Straight up. So I apologize for that, but I'm just not gonna risk it. Alright, let's get into the second OLED specific one, and that is OLED striping and vertical banding. You'll have this to some degree on any OLED display, it's just inherent to how they're manufactured right now. I've asked some buddies of mine that have OLED displays to send me pictures of their OLED monitors displaying very low brightness scenes. Just extremely low brightness and then just a flat 5% gray background. And it's there, it exists. The OLED striping is there even if they can't see it. You can clearly see it on the photo. And yes, it's also a thing on my monitor. Now you'll really only see this if you're looking for it, but if you're doing color critical work, it's good to keep in mind that OLED can have some banding. And the final con is that OLEDs are less bright than LCD, especially the new mini LED stuff coming out. It's gonna be less bright, okay? Now we'll get into why on this display specifically this is less of an issue in the pros section of this review. But for right now, just keep in mind, OLEDs still gonna be less bright even if you can mitigate it using something like APL. Time for the QD-OLED specific cons. Think the screen coating. The screen coating on QD-OLED, as you might know, in a bright environment, when you have light shining onto your monitor, it will appear slightly grayish/purplish depending on the temperature of the light. Keep this in mind. The other thing is HDR brightness. WOLED can get brighter for whites, but QD-OLED makes up for it with color vibrance at higher luminance levels. And the final one is text rendering on this display. It has a triangle layout to its subpixels, which means stuff like subpixel rendering does not work correctly on this display. WRGB has its own issues with that. That's being addressed. You'll see that in reviews coming up from other people. I won't be able to afford one of those monitors after buying this. Hell no. Alright, finally time for the monitor specific ones. On this specific display, you can choose between HDMI and Displayport to connect it over to your computer, console, whatever. You know, of course, you're going to be using HDMI if you're connecting it to your console. It has a 4K 120 mode. Just saying. And now HDMI supports 12-bit color on all refresh rates at 1440p. But it doesn't lock off and there's no way to turn off the 4K mode. And some games will default to 4K. Take Quake Champions for example, it will default to 4K. When you try to set 1440p, it will think you're using a 120Hz monitor, and you have to play borderless windowed instead of full screen. This is an issue that you won't get on Displayport, but you'll be limited to 10-bit colors. But as far as I know, this panel is 10-bit anyways, so you're probably not losing out on much. Just know it won't accept the 12-bit signal over Displayport, where it will over HDMI. On top of that, display stream compression is always on this monitor and it causes issues. Whenever you alt tab, you get a pretty long black screen, like 4 to 5 seconds, instead of it just switching instantly and quickly. This was one of my biggest annoyances with this display when I first got it, but I got used to it after a day or two. But just know, it's there. I do believe this is NVIDIA card specific, but unfortunately I only have NVIDIA cards and I can't check if Intel or AMD handles this better. Alright, and now the final negative thing about this display, which is the Pixelshift. For some reason, despite this panel having over provisioning where Pixelshift can go and still display the screen, the full screen, it goes off the screen. I have a picture of this, look right now, there it is, it goes off the screen. It does it to the right of the screen as well. This is something that annoys me a lot and I hope it gets fixed in a firmware update. But let's start getting into the pros of this monitor. Of course, it being an OLED, the black levels. They're perfect in a dark room because this is QD-OLED, and on the sRGB and Displayport modes, the first level of the grays is also lifted up high enough that you won't have any issues spotting people in the shadows. Now on native you can use the black equalizer to get a similar result, but it will crush black levels out of the box, and so will Adobe RGB, but that does not have access to the black equalizer. The monitor also comes with a factory calibration chart, which goes over the accuracy that they have calibrated it to in the sRGB mode. These numbers promise something incredible, and having seen sRGB mode measurements from other outlets who actually have access to tools to double check this, it's probably pretty close to accurate, honestly. So, hats off. Now an advantage that something like OLED has over mini LED is where it doesn't need to run a backlight algorithm because every pixel dims itself. This means no additional input lag when you're playing HDR games, and it handles small bright highlights better than a mini LED would. But due to OLED's higher power consumption, it will be limiting its brightness in higher APL scenes. I'll come back to this later. But right now I want to talk about the response time of OLED. It's just no competition. My LCD can show up to 4 frames at the same time because it just doesn't switch fast enough. Now this is one of the earlier generation 360Hz 1080p panels. Apparently the 1440p one is a lot better, and I reckon the TN ones will also fare a little bit better than this one, but just look over at the OLED. It is nearly perfect. Whereas the LCD still shows previous frames kind of glowing underneath the current frame. That and the OLED seems to be half a refresh faster than the 360Hz I have set on the LCD. It's not a massive difference, but it's there, and it's an improvement in technology that results in a very responsive experience and a very sharp experience in motion, even though it's sample and hold. Now the XV25QF does improve a slight bit when you're using backlight strobing, but it still doesn't touch OLED, because you do still see the ghosting of the previous frames during the backlight strobe, which I tended not to use because it did give me eye strain on this monitor. Alright, I want to cover one more thing here regarding the panel before I move on to my very limited coverage of the stand. So in my opinion, the most impactful HDR experience you can get is by setting your monitor to HDR game, setting the contrast to 50 in the profile, and setting dark enhance to off. Now even with dark enhance off, it will still be slightly too bright in the darker parts, but it will significantly reduce the overbrightening that this monitor profile for HDR has. You could also go the HDR 400 True Black route by just having the HDR mode on with the APL to medium, which is reportedly very accurate, but I can't double check this on my unit. I just don't have the money for the tools right now to show you this data, and I don't plan on reviewing expensive products like this all the time. I just can't afford to. And that brings me to my admittedly lackluster coverage of the stand that comes with the display. The display has a very large V-shaped foot, which I have some objects next to it for scale. I don't like this type of monitor stand, but it does come with plenty of adjustment. It can swivel plus or minus 20 degrees, it can pivot 90 degrees clockwise. The height adjustment has a range of 130 millimeters, at least according to Gigabyte, and the tilt is -5 to +20 degrees. It's all pretty typical. It's your bare minimum stand in my opinion, it just takes up a lot of space. Which is why I recommend VESA mounting this display, honestly. Oh yeah, I almost forgot to include this in the video, and it's that you can use APL medium in the OLED care settings to actually improve the brightness in most scenes in sRGB content. So if you're playing a game that's exclusively sRGB and you still want to have the extra brightness to be able to have more visibility, this is how. You can also go for the DCI-P3 route or Displayport and get that extra bit of color vibrance as well. And on that note, thank you guys for watching. I'm feeling a little bit sick right now, but I still decided to put this video out. If you made it this far into the video, maybe drop a like, maybe a sub, but you can also roast my cable management in the comments, because it is bad.